We have got ourselves another affordable gaming monitor. It's called the AOC Q27G4X, which sports a flat 27-inch IPS panel, a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate of up to 180Hz. There's also support for adaptive sync technologies and HDR. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found for just £230, making it quite an interesting proposition. So in this review, go and see if it's actually worth this price tag and how it compares to some of its competitors. So jumping straight in, let's talk about its input lag. And here I had it objectively tested at 0 milliseconds, which really took me by surprise. The same could be said about another monitor that I recently reviewed in the form of the HP Omen 27Q, which sports a similar panel. Now, nonetheless, in terms of my own subjective opinion, I felt that this monitor responded phenomenally well to my mouse inputs while playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, which is actually very demanding, and therefore having a lower input lag is very much preferred. Now, as an aside, I would just like to point out that my tests were conducted with the low input lag mode enabled. In fact, I have no idea why you'd ever want to disable it. However, it's worth pointing out that with adaptive sync technologies such as AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync, or if you're going to be running this monitor at 60Hz refresh rate, then you'll find that the low input lag mode becomes grayed out via the monitor's OSD. Nothing to be overly concerned about because from my own subjective testing I didn't notice a night and day difference, but it does slightly hamper the overall input lag that one can attain. Now, the same couldn't be quite said about the overall response time. Now, for me to expand on this, it's worth noting that there's a few different overdrive modes you can select via the monitor's OSD. You've got off, weak, medium, strong, and boost. Now here, depending on which overdrive mode you go for, you'll get a better response time. In other words, the monitor will feel a lot more snappy. However, on the flip side, you might get a worse visual experience due to inverse ghosting. Now, for me to demonstrate this, I'm using the OSRTD tool. And you can see over here with the overdrive set to off, the average initial time, which translates to the average G2G, which is often quoted by manufacturers, sitting at a pretty disappointing 7.22 milliseconds. Nonetheless, if you go to the weak mode preset, you can see the average initial time drops down to 6.36 milliseconds. Where it's actually recommended to use, however, is on the medium overdrive mode, with the average initial time sitting at 4.89 milliseconds. With the RGB overshoot, which you can see towards the middle of your screen, sitting at next to 0. However, it's worth considering that the percent in Windows sits at 63%, which is actually quite disappointing. In other words, the 180Hz refresh rate isn't quite being hit depending on the certain transitions. Now, if we go on the strongest mode overdrive, you can see that the percent in window has become a lot better at 90%, with the average initial time dropping down to 2.99 milliseconds, which is very much impressive. However, the RGB overshoot becomes a bit too much. You can see there's a lot more error on your screen and therefore means that this monitor cannot be used really on its strongest mode overdrive, even while playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, let alone more visually appealing games such as Destiny 2 or other. Now, for me to demonstrate the visual impact, I'm using the UFO ghosting test. And here you can see between the different overdrive modes that on the strong mode preset, specifically towards the lighter shades, there's quite a little bit of inverse ghosting. In other words, there's that trail that occurs behind the UFO, and this can actually throw you off in games. However, on the medium preset, it's completely negligible and therefore is the one that I'd recommend. Again, just going based on what I just said before, the overall response time is affected. Now, you do also have the boost mode preset, and this effectively goes for having the strong mode overdrive with the motion blur reduction enabled. So this is going to give you inverse ghosting, but also a slightly clearer image. However, what I would recommend is going on the MBR levels where you've got 20 different increments to choose from and then selecting your own overdrive mode that you'd like. In my case over here, I'm demonstrating that you can go for MBR 20 with the medium preset and therefore get 0 inverse ghosting, all while getting a much more clear image. Now, in terms of the overall motion clarity, this IPS panel doesn't do too badly. Although, as you were able to notice via the UFOs, that of course if you do enable motion blur reduction technologies, it really does improve the overall experience. The only thing worth noting, however, is that MBR does limit in terms of the overall brightness that one can attain, and also the fact that it cannot be simultaneously used with HDR. Although that's no surprise, but just something I thought I should highlight. However, you will be pleased to know that motion blur reduction technologies can work simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies. In other words, AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync, which is absolutely fantastic, specifically at this price point. Indeed, over here, I was able to run it over a DisplayPort cable to my RTX 3080, and while running Nvidia G-Sync at 1440p and at 180Hz, I was also able to run MBR. You'll have to enable the MBR sync mode in order for you to benefit from all these technologies working in tandem. Now, with the motion blur reduction technology disabled, I was able to run HDR. And here, yet again, I was able to run it with my RTX 3080 while connected over DisplayPort and running at 1440p at 180Hz with Nvidia G-Sync. I didn't incur any sort of flickering or black screen issues. Now, the overall HDR experience isn't anything to really shout about. However, I do appreciate that the manufacturer has finely tuned the overall color accuracy, and therefore even over HDR, you will actually get a pretty decent experience. And therefore, if you have got the ability of running an HDR signal, for example in a game or a movie, then it's something that you might want to consider doing. So next up, I would just like to have a quick word for console gamers. And here the monitor has got two HDMI 2.0 inputs, therefore allowing you to output 1440p at 120Hz. You can of course run it at 1080p if you so wish, and I did also notice that it does actually accept a 4K signal input, which isn't the same that could have been said about some of its competitors. Now the monitor at 120Hz does actually fare pretty well. Here you'll be able to see via the OSRTD tool on its medium overdrive mode, which again is the recommended preset, it had an average initial time of 4.4 milliseconds, with the percent in window sitting at a very high 93%. With the strong mode overdrive, you can see over here that the average initial time does drop down to 2.86 milliseconds, but yet again the RGB overshoot is a bit too much. At 60Hz, you have also got an average initial time of 4.32 milliseconds at the overdrive set to medium, and this is again the recommended mode, but if you were to go on the strong mode preset, you'll be again able to see that you've got a lot more RGB overshoot, but you have got a lower average initial time of 2.83 milliseconds. Yet again, for me to demonstrate the visual experience over here, you can see the UFO ghosting test. Now it's worth pointing out over here that MBR is available at 120Hz as it is at the highest refresh rate, but it's not available at 60Hz, which is nothing to be surprised about, but just something I thought I should highlight. Past this gaming performance, let's talk about image quality. And here you have got a 27-inch flat IPS panel with a matte coating to it. Now 3D Monitor's OSD, you have also got a dedicated sRGB mode with full brightness controls, which is very much appreciated. Now in said mode and using my calibrators, I noticed a gamut coverage of 92.1% and a gamut volume of 96.4%. Below you can see how it compares to the sRGB standards. As for the overall color accuracy, it sat at an average delta of 1.69 and a maximum of 2.88, which is actually pretty impressive, and therefore this monitor can be used for serious image editing work or video grading. As for its overall tested contrast ratio, it is actually also pretty good, at least for an IPS panel, sitting at 1276 to 1. In terms of its gamma curve, it also sits pretty close to the 2.2 standard. What isn't as impressive, however, is its measured white point. At least in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target, it was recorded at 5896 Kelvin at 100%. Now, should you not be editing in the sRGB color space and therefore want a little bit of extra pop of your image, then you might want to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor. And indeed, via the native preset, you can see that the gamut coverage and gamut volumes have positively been affected in the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 color spaces. Here, I'll be looking at the DCI-P3 color space, and you can see below how it compares. The average delta and maximum delta, however, are not that impressive, at 3.74 and 12.05 respectively, meaning that this monitor cannot be used, at least for color work, in the DCI-P3 color space. The tested contrast ratio does not change, however its measured white point does become a lot closer to the target at 6339 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, it still sits closer to 2.2 standard, however that's not quite good for the 2.6 standard which is required for the DCI-P3 color space. Now, aside from this, the monitor does also get pretty bright. At least in HDR, I recorded a peak of 465 nits. In SDR, it's still plenty bright at 354 nits, and therefore meaning that this monitor can be used in a bright sunlit room. In fact, I used it majority of the time at 60 to 70% brightness. However, it's worth considering over here that if you were to enable the boost mode overdrive setting or the MBR levels, this will actually go and reduce the overall brightness, getting all the way down to 174 nits. As for its minimum brightness, it sits at 68 nits, which isn't as low as some of its competitors, but still gives you a good sort of range, and therefore meaning this monitor can be used in a pretty dark room. On that note, it brings me on to brightness uniformity. And of course over here it's somewhat panel lottery, so your monitor might differ from mine. But on my tested panel, you'll be able to see at the top right hand side it didn't fare too well, which is actually quite disappointing. As for the overall backlight bleed, it was perfectly acceptable, at least for myself. However, if you're going to be playing a lot of dark games or movies, then you might want to look at a TN, VA, or of course if you can afford it, an OLED, because this will mean that you're not going to have any sort of IPS bleed to worry about. Moving on, let's talk about build quality. And here it's got a 3-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. I also appreciate the fact that AOC have gone for an all black finish, in comparison to the black and red finish that some of its older generation models had. Now here you have got a stand which is actually pretty nicely designed, and you've also got great ergonomics, because the stand itself provides you height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments. In fact, you can rotate it both ways. Of course, if you do not like the built-in stand or you simply want to replace it, you can do so with a VESA compatible stand, allowing you to mount it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now for you to interact with the monitor, there are a few physical buttons positioned at the bottom right hand side. They're not as intuitive to use in comparison to some rival alternatives, but nonetheless will suffice. Specifically given that the OSD itself is actually comprehensively laid out and provides you all the right options that you'll require. Furthermore, you've also got an extension to this via the AOC G menu software. It provides you a degree of customization that you can do on the fly. Now, I would also like to mention over here that the monitor has not got any sort of built-in speakers. However, you have got a 3.5mm jack output, allowing you to plug in your headphones directly into the monitor. Now elsewhere, you have got those two HDMI 2.0 ports, which might be of interest to certain gamers, specifically those on console, but you have also got a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input. Now the latter will give you the full resolution and refresh rate, however the former two will limit you at 144Hz. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict. And truthfully, I feel that the AOC Q27G4X is aimed at the casual gamer, or those who play on console. And I say the latter because it actually does perform relatively well at 120Hz and 60Hz. You've also got support for adaptive sync technologies and HDR. Couple that at the fact that you have got a 1440p resolution, a comprehensively laid out OSD and a good build quality, and also an affordable price tag of £230, and it makes this monitor worthy of my recommendation. As such, it gets my value awards. However, I can't wholeheartedly recommend this monitor given what else you can find out there in the market. Indeed, I recently reviewed the HP Omen 27Q, which actually does perform very well across the board, and is arguably my top pick, at least if you're looking for a budget 1440p monitor with a 27-inch form factor. Of course, you've got some other monitors that you might want to consider, some of which I've reviewed and will be down in the description below for you in consideration. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of this AOC monitor down in the comment section below and how you feel it compares to some of its rivals. Now, if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification. All of which would be greatly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.